Tonight we're going to talk about Johann Gutenberg and his great invention. If you hear some whining in the background, that would be Breeze. He's being a little high maintenance tonight, but we're moving on anyway. First, I want you to think about the Middle Ages. Knights in armor, stone castles, food cooked on open fires, long journeys on horseback, silk and spices from Asia. Now think about the world today. Cars, airplanes, phones, computers, Legos, movies. What invention did the most to change the world? The answer might surprise you. The printing press. Without printed books, the Renaissance might never have happened, and our modern world would look very different. Before the printing press was invented, books were written by hand. Do you remember reading about the medieval monks who copied out manuscripts in their monasteries? Of course you do. You had to do it for a project. They had to make paper called parchment out of animal skin. Then they had to mix up ink, sharpen a feather into a pen, and write out each letter of each book. One book might take years to finish. When it was done, it was put in the monastery library and chained to the shelf so no one could take it away. Only kings and very rich men could afford to have these books. There were no picture books, no magazines, no newspapers, no printed instructions or directions. Imagine having to remember everything I've ever said. During the Middle Ages, merchants trading with China learned how to make paper from the Chinese. This paper was made by soaking bark, straw, or old rags in water, pressing it into sheets, and drying it. Paper was much easier and quicker to make than animal skin parchment. Now these merchants could keep records of how many pieces of silk or pottery they had sold, but they still had to write all of their facts and figures by hand. There were still no books. Imagine for a moment that you live in a world without printed books, instructions, or directions. You want to play a new board game that came with 5 different sets of playing pieces, a spinner, 2 dice, 1 black and 1 yellow, and a funny metal chain with rectangular links. There are no instructions. How will you figure out what to do with all those game parts? Eventually, you might figure out how to play a game with the board and its parts, but your rules won't be like anyone else's. If you visit a friend's house who has the same game, you won't be able to play with them until they explain all of their rules. Pretend that you're a scientist who wants to study the stars, but you don't know what other scientists have already discovered about the stars because you don't have any science books. All you have are eyes in the sky. After years and years of study, you figure out some basic facts about the stars. But it takes you so long to learn these simple facts that you never discover much more. All over the world, other scientists do exactly the same thing. So no one gets very far in his study of the stars. If only you had books. Then you could each learn the basic facts in just a few months of study. Suppose that you are a Christian who wants to find out what the Bible says about right and wrong. But you don't have a Bible. There's a huge Bible chained to the pulpit of the church in your village, but it's written in a language you can't read. So you ask your priest what the Bible says. He doesn't read very well either, so he tells you what his priest told him years and years ago when he asked the same question. He might be right or he might be wrong. That's what life was like in Europe during the Middle Ages. Because there were so few books, scientists didn't make very new discoveries. Historians couldn't find out much about the past. Doctors knew very little about the human body, and Christians had to find out what the Bible said by asking their priests. They had to trust their priests to give them the right information. Then everything changed. A young man in Germany was learning how to be a goldsmith. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. As he melted his gold and silver and poured the metal into molds, Johann Gutenberg began to wonder whether he could also mold letters out of metal. He thought to himself, I could fit the letters together to form a metal page. Then I could dip the metal page down into ink and press it onto paper. I can make hundreds of paper copies in no time at all. And then I could rearrange the letters to make another page. Gutenberg experimented with finding just the right kind of metal for his pages. It had to be soft enough to press down on a page without shattering, but hard enough to stay in shape. He had to make molds for each letter, pour the letters in, wait for them to cool, and then remove them. His ink had to be just the right thickness, thick enough to cling to the metal when he dipped it in, but thin enough to come off the metal onto the paper. He had to find a way to lift the metal page up and press it down over and over again. After years of experimenting, Gutenberg made a printing press from an old wine press that had been used to squeeze grapes. He made metal letters out of a mixture of tin, lead, and another poisonous metal. He made a new kind of ink with oil in it, and he began to work on his great project, a Bible. It took him several years to set the metal letters into the place for the pages, but once the pages were set, Gutenberg and his helpers printed 450 Bibles in 1 year. If 20 monks had tried to write out these Bibles by hand, it would have taken them 90 years each. Gutenberg began printing his Bibles in 1455 and 1456. In the following years, others borrowed Gutenberg's technique. An English merchant named William Caxton got interested not just in printing books, but in translating them into languages that people could actually read. He printed books of history and poetry in English. He also printed a book about how to play chess, the first set of written directions. As time went on, more and more books were printed. Books became cheaper and cheaper. More and more people could buy them and read. Now, ordinary, everyday men and women could read about the past glories of Greece and Rome. Explorers could find out what other explorers had discovered on their journeys. Scientists could read what other scientists were learning and doing in other countries. And Christians could read their own Bibles written in their own languages.